Vintage Rolex?
How did an orphan with no money or connections create the world's most famous watch brand? A large part of Rolex's history is shrouded in secrecy and mystery. However, today we will delve into the incredible wealth story of Rolex. And most importantly, we will learn why Rolex is so expensive. The Rolex story begins with the company's innovative and mysterious founder, Hans Wilsdorf. Hans was born in 1881 in Germany to Anna and Jean. His childhood was filled with love and happiness. However, this was cut short by tragedy. When he was just 12 years old, both his mother and father unexpectedly passed away within a few months of each other. His uncle sent him to a boarding school, and Hans, deeply affected by the hardships he faced, was initially very discouraged. However, he soon decided to focus on his studies as a way to escape his situation. He especially enjoyed learning different languages, which would later open the door for him to move abroad. In Switzerland, Hans started working at a company called Kuno Korten, a major exporter of pocket watches. Being fluent in German, English, and French, Hans worked as a clerk and correspondent for the company. Since the company produced its own watches, this role gave Hans the opportunity to understand watchmaking and closely examine the horology industry. Although his daily tasks included repetitive actions like winding hundreds of watches, he developed a deep appreciation for the craft and became obsessed with the idea of creating perfect timepieces. Later, in 1903, Hans moved to London to work for another company, where he had a bigger role in finding new sales and customers. This gave him the opportunity to understand what made one watch brand stand out from another and how crucial marketing was to a brand's success. While these different jobs were quite enjoyable, Hans had much bigger dreams and was eager to apply the skills he had learned for himself. At the age of 24, in 1905, Hans decided to establish his own watch company. He had saved a small amount of money to invest in the business, but most of the funds came from his future business partner, Alfred Davis. Together, they founded Wilsdorf and Davis and began importing Swiss watches to sell in the United Kingdom. At that time, wristwatches were not as popular as they are today and were mostly seen as women's accessories. In fact, Hans' friends believed that a small, delicate mechanism inside a wristwatch would be fragile and easily break. They also argued that such a small watch would not be able to display the time accurately. Pocket watches were much more preferred. However, Hans believed that pocket watches would eventually disappear and wristwatches would definitely replace them. He only thought that they needed to be of high quality. So, Hans ignored all the criticism and spent all of the company's money to place one of the largest wristwatch orders ever at that time. He firmly believed that wristwatches would dominate the future, but everyone thought he was crazy. Even his business partner was skeptical. However, Hans did not give up. He met with the best watchmakers, learning at least one new thing from each of them. Using an old connection from his time in Switzerland, he started importing Swiss-made movements to produce high-quality wristwatches. Hans knew that quality alone was not enough and that brand awareness was the most important factor. Everything depended on having a memorable name. The story of how the Rolex name was created is quite interesting. Hans claimed that he had tried hundreds of name combinations using different letters, but none of them felt right. One day, while scribbling at work, something unusual happened. According to Hans, a genie whispered the name Rolex into his ear. Regardless of the true origin of the story, the name was perfect. Rolex was short, easy to remember, and simple to pronounce in every language. Additionally, the name Rolex carried an elegant and authoritative feel. Because of this, Hans started engraving the name on the dials of all his watches, which helped increase brand recognition. A few years later, they even changed the company's full name to Rolex Ltd. New Rolex watches began selling quickly. In fact, in 1910, Rolex became the first wristwatch to receive a precision certificate. Then, in 1914, the British Kew Observatory awarded a Rolex watch an A-class rating, a distinction never before given to a wristwatch. Rolex was now associated with quality, which helped drive more sales. However, in 1914, World War I broke out. At that time, the Rolex headquarters in London had over 60 employees and had become an export hub for all of its markets. But during the war, Germany became an enemy of Britain. Since Hans was of German descent and had a German name and accent, tensions began to rise. But that wasn't the only issue. The British government imposed a 33% tax on all luxury goods during the war. To avoid any trouble and take advantage of significant tax benefits, Hans decided to move Rolex's headquarters to Switzerland, which remained neutral during the war. While many watch companies went bankrupt during World War I, Rolex thrived. Wristwatches proved to be more reliable and practical for soldiers compared to pocket watches, making them a favorite among military personnel. The real rapid growth of Rolex, however, was undoubtedly due to Hans' marketing genius. In the 1920s, he began offering his watches to explorers, athletes, racers, pilots, and many other successful individuals. This helped create a strong association between Rolex and high achievement in the minds of consumers. Additionally, Hans understood the value of product placement far earlier than his competitors and ran hundreds of cleverly crafted advertisements on radio and in newspapers. These brilliant marketing strategies continued in 1926 when Rolex created the world's first commercially available fully waterproof watch. Once again, Hans excelled in marketing. He heard about a woman planning to swim across the English Channel and convinced her to wear Rolex's new waterproof watch during the swim. This turned the Oyster model into a global sensation. After spending over 10 hours in the freezing water, the Rolex Oyster emerged completely intact, making headlines worldwide. Hans also instructed Rolex retailers to display the waterproof Oyster watches inside fish tanks with real fish swimming around them. This inevitably caught the attention of passers-by. Another major milestone in Rolex's history came just 5 years later. In 1931, Rolex engineers developed the perpetual rotor, an automatic winding mechanism for watches. Hans also made it his mission to ensure that the world's most famous and daring individuals wore Rolex watches. The first flights over Mount Everest were conducted by crews wearing Rolex watches. Similarly, in 1935, Malcolm Campbell broke the land speed record while wearing a Rolex. Thanks to this perfect combination of marketing strategies and groundbreaking innovations, Rolex continued to grow and gain popularity. By 1945, on the company's 40th anniversary, Rolex revolutionized the watch world again with the launch of the Datejust, the first automatic wristwatch with a date window on its dial. However, shortly before the launch, Hans experienced another tragedy. His beloved wife, Florence, passed away from an illness. Having lost his parents at 12, Hans was now a 63-year-old widower with no children. Realizing the importance of securing the company's future, Hans established the Wilsdorf Foundation in 1946 and transferred 100% ownership of Rolex to the foundation. Today, this foundation still owns and controls Rolex. Since Rolex is owned by a foundation, it is not a corporation and does not pay corporate taxes. Instead, most of its profits are reportedly used for educational scholarships and charity work. However, Rolex is not required to publicly disclose financial information. Despite all these challenges, Rolex remains one of the most prestigious brands in the world today. The legacy of Hans Wilsdorf is truly extraordinary. If you want to hear more incredible stories like this, make sure to follow my channel.